I was wearing my mother's pearl earrings when I realized no one from my family was coming. I stood in the bridal room at the Lakewood Country Club on the south side of Houston, and I kept looking at my phone, kept refreshing my email, kept listening for the sound of my mother's voice in the hallway saying she had arrived early, that she wanted to help me with my hair. That phone never buzzed. No one arrived early. No one arrived at all. My name is Michaela, and I was 28 years old when I learned that all the love I had invested in my family had earned me exactly nothing in return. Looking into that mirror, I watched my makeup artist, a kind woman named Patricia from the salon on Bel Air Boulevard, carefully apply the final touches of my mascara. She was being extra gentle, I think because she could see something in my face that I was trying very hard not to show. A kind of slow-motion heartbreak. A recognition that I had been preparing for this day for 2 years, and the people who were supposed to be most excited to witness it had decided, collectively, that my happiness was somehow a betrayal. Let me back up. Let me tell you who my father really was, because you can't understand how we got to that moment without knowing what kind of man he had been my entire life. My father's name was Gregory, and he had always made it abundantly clear which of his children mattered most. I had a younger brother named Marcus. Marcus was gifted with his father's confidence and his father's ruthlessness, and from the time Marcus was 12 years old, he was the golden child in every way that counted. Private schools that cost more per year than some people make in their lifetime. Summer programs in Europe. Connections to his father's business associates. When Marcus's first startup failed spectacularly, and I mean spectacularly, we're talking about misallocated funds and promises he couldn't keep, my father didn't hesitate. He liquidated business assets to bail him out. No lectures. No consequences. Just the swift, quiet rescue that told Marcus he would always be protected, always be elevated, no matter what damage he left behind. I was the daughter. I was the one who was supposed to understand that success meant working harder than everyone else, complaining less than everyone else, and accepting that the family's resources had a hierarchy, and I was near the bottom of it. I remember being 16 when I asked my father for help with college applications. He was sitting at the kitchen table in our house in Meyerland, reading the newspaper, and I had spent weeks collecting my transcripts and organizing my materials. He didn't look up. He just said, "Your mother can help you with that." That was it. 15 seconds of acknowledgement, if you could even call it that. But my mother, bless her heart, she had learned long ago not to disagree with Gregory. She had learned to smile and nod and make herself smaller so that his confidence could expand to fill the entire room. So she helped me, quietly, in the evenings after my father had gone to bed. I spent my 20s trying to prove that I was worthy of his attention. I graduated summa cum laude from the University of Houston. I landed a stable job at an energy consulting firm downtown, actual 6 figures by the time I was 25. I bought my own condo in the Montrose neighborhood. I was building a life, and I genuinely believed, with the kind of naive hope that only comes from deep desperation for parental approval, that at some point, my father would see what I had accomplished and would finally say something that felt like love. That belief made me incredibly vulnerable to his manipulation. 10 years before my wedding day, my father approached me with what he called a protective measure. He wanted us to open a joint checking account. He explained it with the kind of fatherly concern that I had learned to mistake for actual affection. He said it was a safety net, that he wanted to be able to transfer emergency funds to me if I ever found myself stranded or in crisis. He made it sound like the most loving thing a father could do. I remember actually tearing up when he suggested it. I thought, finally, he sees me as someone worth protecting. I signed the paperwork at the small regional bank he had recommended, and I felt like I had finally cracked the code. I had finally done something right enough to earn his care. After college, I opened my own independent accounts. I secured my consulting job. I built my life without ever thinking about that joint account again. I assumed it had been closed years ago due to inactivity. I had no reason to think about it. It was just a thing that existed in the background of my financial history, a relic from a time when I still believed my father's words meant something. What I didn't know was that my father had kept it open. What I didn't know was that over the course of a decade, he had turned that account into something far darker, a financial shield for his failing empire. He was using it as a dumping ground for his business transactions, questionable transfers, unauthorized commercial lines of credit, secured with what amounted to my signature. He was using my clean financial record, my spotless credit history, my reputation as a stable and trustworthy person, as camouflage for his own desperation. I only discovered the truth when I was doing standard credit checks for my wedding. It was the kind of thing you're supposed to do before a major life event, right? Check your credit report. Make sure there are no surprises. Ensure that your financial life is clean before you merge it with someone else's. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment I saw the account still had an outstanding balance. That was the moment I saw the transaction history and realized my father had been committing fraud against me for a decade. The money he had funneled through that account over the years was staggering. But more than the numbers, it was the feeling of violation that hit me the hardest. My father hadn't just borrowed my identity, he had weaponized it. He had taken the thing I was most proud of, my reputation as a trustworthy, reliable person, and he had turned it into a tool for his own financial games. I couldn't even cry when I saw it. I was too angry. I was too shocked. I sat in my apartment that night, my laptop open to the transaction history, and I made a decision. I was not going to let this go. I was not going to be silent. I was not going to protect him the way my mother had protected him, the way I had been trained to protect him my entire life. I contacted a forensic accountant that same night. Her name was Catherine, and when I explained the situation, she didn't hesitate. She said, "We need to move quickly, and we need to be thorough." We spent the next 2 weeks compiling evidence, bank statements, forged signatures, documentation of every unauthorized credit line, every fraudulent check, every single dollar that my father had funneled through my account to dodge his creditors. Catherine prepared a comprehensive report and filed it with state banking investigators exactly 5 days before my wedding. She also helped me file a formal complaint with the Corporate Fraud Division. The wheels were already in motion before I ever walked down the aisle. I was getting married, yes, but I was also quietly building a case against my father. I never told my husband, David, exactly what had happened. He knew there was tension with my family, but I didn't want our engagement to be consumed by the weight of my father's crimes. So I carried that secret with me right up until the moment I walked into that country club, and when I looked into that empty front row, part of me understood, in a way I hadn't before, that my father's absence was something I should be grateful for. Because the evidence was already filed. The investigators were already moving, and he had no idea that the trap was already closing. The flowers in the bride's room were white roses and pale purple lisianthus, and they smelled like every expectation I had learned to swallow. Patricia asked if I wanted to take a moment before walking down the aisle, and I told her I was ready. I wasn't ready, but I was prepared. There's a difference. I could feel my hands shaking as I held my bouquet, but when the doors opened and that music started, I walked forward with my head high. The aisle was lined with people David's friends, his family, people who had come because they genuinely wanted to celebrate our union, and in the front rows, where my mother and my brother and my father should have been, there was nothing but empty chairs and the cold air of rejection. But here's what you need to understand about what I was feeling in that moment. I wasn't broken. I wasn't devastated. I was furious in a way that felt almost clean, almost purposeful. I was walking toward a new life, and I was walking away from people who had never deserved to be part of it. David cried when I reached the altar. He later told me he was crying because he had never seen me look so strong. I don't know if that's true, but I believe he believed it, and that was enough. The wedding went perfectly. David and I exchanged vows that we actually meant. We danced. We celebrated with the people who had shown up for us. And that night, I felt lighter than I had felt in years. Let me be honest with you, there was a part of me that hoped that seeing the wedding photos would shame my family into reaching out. That maybe my mother would call and say she regretted missing it. That maybe my father would finally see that I had grown into someone worthy of his pride. That hope was the last mistake I made. That hope was also the last thing my father needed to seal his own fate. The morning after the wedding, I was in the kitchen with David, making coffee, still wearing my wedding dress because I didn't want to take it off yet. My phone buzzed. It was a text message from my father. "No, congratulations. No, I'm sorry." Just a text that said, "I need $8,400 wired to my account immediately. This is not negotiable." Nothing in the text suggested why. No emergency, no explanation. Just a demand from a man who had boycotted my wedding and then reached out only to ask for money. He didn't even say please. I stared at that text for a long time. David asked me what was wrong, and I showed it to him. I could see the anger rising in his face, but I felt something different. I felt a strange clarity. I knew exactly what this was. My father had discovered that his account was locked. The $1 transfer I had made 2 weeks earlier when I sent him that petty dollar with the note. For your thoughts had triggered banking security protocols. The system had flagged the tiny, unusual transfer into that dormant account as potential suspicious activity designed to verify the account before a larger cyber hack. The bank's automated security measures had locked the entire account. My father was trapped. He couldn't make deposits. He couldn't hide the paper trail. He couldn't cover the fraudulent check he had written. The clock was ticking toward the moment when the banking system would automatically alert corporate fraud investigators. So he did what people in desperation do. He acted without thinking. He demanded the money in a text message. He expected me to panic. He expected me to comply. He expected me to be the same person I had always been, the daughter who swallowed her needs to protect her father's reputation. What he didn't know was that I was not that person anymore. I was a person who had hired a forensic accountant. I was a person who had filed complaints with state investigators. I was a person who had chosen herself, finally, completely, and irreversibly. I looked at David and I said, "Don't worry. I know exactly what this is, and I know exactly what to do." I opened my banking app. I transferred exactly $1 into his account. Then I added a note. "Still thinking about how much your love is worth." Within minutes, my phone started exploding with calls. My father screaming at me. My mother calling to beg me to send him the money. My brother's frantic messages saying I had destroyed the family. But I didn't pick up. I let the phone ring. I was done protecting them. I was done feeling guilty. I was done living in the shadow of their shame. Exactly 2 weeks passed after that exchange. David and I had fallen into the gentle rhythm of our early married life. We were unpacking boxes in our new place in Uptown. We were planning a weekend trip to the coast. We were breathing deeply, finally, the way people do when they step out of a storm. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, around 6 o'clock, when the pounding started on our front door. Not a normal knock, an aggressive, authoritative pounding. David went to answer it, and I heard his voice change in a way I had never heard before. I came out of the bedroom, and standing on our porch were 2 uniformed police officers. Their expressions were grim, professional, the way you see in crime dramas right before someone's life gets turned upside down. But it was the man standing behind them that made my blood go absolutely cold. It was my father, Gregory. He wasn't dressed in the expensive suits he usually wore to his office. He was wearing casual clothes, and his face was twisted into an expression that I can only describe as vindictive triumph. He looked like he had finally won something. He looked like he had finally broken through my defenses. Before the officers could even state their purpose, he shoved his way forward. His face was flushed. His chest was heaving. He looked directly at me and pointed an aggressive, shaking finger in my direction. "That's her!" he screamed, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "That's my daughter, and she's a thief! Officers, that girl right there committed grand larceny and bank fraud. She stole thousands and thousands of dollars from my business account. Arrest her right now. Please, arrest her." David immediately stepped in front of me. He demanded an explanation. He said, "What is he talking about? What is going on?" But the officers held up their hands to quiet him. They had heard these kinds of accusations before. They had learned not to react with shock. The older officer, a man with gray at his temples and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much, turned his gaze toward me and pulled out a small notepad. He said very slowly and very clearly, "Ma'am, your father has filed a formal criminal complaint against you. He is alleging theft and bank fraud. We need you to explain your financial relationship with him, and we need to see your financial records immediately." The world didn't spin. The world didn't go quiet. Instead, the world became hyper-real in the way that trauma makes everything sharp and impossibly clear. I could see the texture of the officers' uniforms. I could see the tiny beads of sweat on my father's forehead. I could see my neighbors across the street, standing on their lawns, watching this play out. I could see David's hands clenching into fists as he prepared to defend me. And in that moment, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't panicked. I was cold. I was absolutely, perfectly calm. Because I had been waiting for this moment. I had been preparing for it. I knew exactly what was in my father's mind. He thought that by involving the police, by making a public accusation, by attacking me before I could attack him, he might somehow create enough chaos and confusion to dodge what was coming. He thought he could bury the truth under the weight of his own accusations. I didn't say a word to the officers right away. Instead, I turned and walked back into my house. David tried to follow me, confused. I could hear my father saying something else, something bitter, and I heard one of the officers telling him to wait on the porch. I walked to the console table in my hallway, the one where we had been piling mail and paperwork since we moved in. And there, exactly where I had placed it days before, was a thick manila folder. I had been expecting this. I had prepared for it. Catherine, my forensic accountant, had finished her comprehensive report the week before, and I had kept it right there, visible and ready, knowing that this moment would come. I returned to the porch and handed the folder directly to the older officer. I said, "I've been expecting this. Everything you need to understand what's actually happening is in that folder." My father's expression shifted. I watched it happen in real time. The smirk faltered. His steel eyes narrowed. He suddenly looked uncertain, and for the first time, I saw something that looked almost like fear. The older officer opened the folder slowly. Inside wasn't a chaotic mess of receipts and accusations. Inside was a meticulous, legally certified paper trail compiled by a licensed forensic accountant. It contained bank statements from the joint account going back 10 years. It contained photocopies of forged signatures, my father's signatures, used without my consent, to secure unauthorized commercial lines of credit. It contained detailed logs of every single dollar he had funneled through my identity to dodge his corporate creditors. It contained emails between him and business associates discussing the strategy of hiding assets in the clean account to avoid bankruptcy filings. It contained my formal complaints filed with state banking investigators, dated 5 days before my wedding. It contained the documentation showing that my father had committed identity theft, that he had committed fraud, that he had used his own daughter's financial reputation as a shield for his own criminal activity. The officers stood under the porch light, reading through the pages. I watched their expressions change. I watched them move from skepticism to absolute sternness. The younger officer looked up from the documents, and his gaze locked directly onto my father. He didn't say anything. He just looked at him. That look said everything. The older officer slowly closed the folder. He turned completely away from me and took a step toward my father. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but the officer held up a hand, silencing him. Then the officer said the words that shattered my father's entire world. "Sir, you're the one in trouble." My father's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The color drained from his face. He suddenly looked not like a powerful businessman or a vindictive father, but like a desperate man who had finally understood his own miscalculation. The officer instructed him to turn around and place his hands behind his back. I heard the metallic click of the handcuffs. I have never heard a more satisfying sound in my entire life. That click was the sound of 10 years of violation coming to an end. That click was the sound of justice finally moving forward. That click was the sound of a truth that could not be denied, could not be appealed, could not be negotiated away. By bringing the police to my doorstep under false pretenses, my father had inadvertently forced an immediate field execution of the identity theft and fraud warrants that had already been approved by state investigators. The moment he made the false accusation to the officers standing on my porch, he sealed his own fate. He wasn't just being detained for filing a false police report. He was being arrested for a decade's worth of systemic financial crimes. He was being arrested for identity theft. He was being arrested for fraud. He was being arrested for bank crimes that carried mandatory sentences. I watched as the officers led him to the police car parked on our street. I watched as neighbors stood on their lawns, witnessing the drama unfold. I watched as my father was placed in the back seat, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not vindication. Just a quiet, clean sense of relief. The trap that had been closing for weeks had finally snapped shut. My father had walked into it with complete confidence that he could manipulate the system, the police, the truth, and his own daughter one final time. He had been wrong. The fallout within my family was immediate and devastating. My mother called me screaming, begging me to drop the charges and save the family name. My brother called, demanding that I explain how I could betray our father. Neither of them understood that there was nothing to drop. The state database had taken over the prosecution. The state investigators had built the case. I was simply the person who had told the truth and had the documentation to back it up. I was simply the person who had chosen not to protect him. Within days, the full extent of my father's financial crimes was laid bare to our extended relatives. The successful businessman persona was revealed to be a house of cards held together by fraud and my family's collective willingness to ignore what was happening. My brother's consulting company, which had been kept afloat entirely by my father's fraudulent transfers, collapsed within a matter of days. Without the constant influx of hidden money, without the fake business lines of credit, without the stolen resources, it couldn't sustain itself. The golden child finally had to face the consequences of his choices. My mother had to face the reality that she had spent 30 years enabling a man whose success had been built on lies. That was perhaps the cruelest awakening of all. 3 months later, the legal process finally came to an end. My father accepted a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial. He received 5 years of strict probation, mandatory restitution of over $200,000 to cover the victims of his fraud, and the liquidation of his remaining business assets. The judge made it clear that he was receiving leniency only because of the lack of violent crime attached to his charges. He could have faced prison time. He likely still will, if he violates probation. The moment his sentencing was finalized, I contacted a family law attorney and officially severed every legal tie to my biological family. I changed the beneficiaries on my accounts. I removed my mother from my emergency contacts. I made it clear in legal documentation that I had no obligation to support them, no obligation to acknowledge them, no obligation to forgive them. Some people think that was harsh. Some people think family bonds should transcend betrayal. But here's what I understand now that I didn't understand before. Family is not a prison sentence. Family is not an obligation that overrides your own safety. Family is something that is earned through respect, through care, through showing up. My biological family failed every single one of those tests. They boycotted my wedding because I chose independence. They stayed silent while my father stole my identity. They only called me when they needed something from me. That is not family. That is trauma wearing a family name. With the corporate insurance settlement and the protected funds that Catherine helped me secure through the legal process, David and I bought a home far away from the suburbs where I grew up. It's a quiet house in a neighborhood where no one knows my past, and no one cares about the drama of my biological family. I wake up in that house, and I breathe deeply, and I thank myself for having the courage to stand alone. I thank myself for hiring the forensic accountant. I thank myself for filing the reports even when it felt terrifying. I thank myself for sending that petty $1 transfer even though it was an act of defiance rather than a logical move. That defiance triggered the security protocol. That defiance was what forced my father's hand. That defiance was what gave me the victory I didn't know I was building toward. Standing up for myself didn't just save my finances. It didn't just protect my credit. It completely redefined my relationship with myself. It taught me that I am capable of being strong in silence. I am capable of building a case while smiling. I am capable of preparing for battle without announcing it. That is a skill I never expected to learn, but it is the most valuable skill I own. Let me be honest with you. A lot of people have asked me if I regret filing the charges. A lot of people have asked if I wish I had just taken the money he asked for, paid him off, kept the peace. And every single time, my answer is the same. No. There is no circumstance under which I would have been the villain in that story. My father chose to commit fraud. My father chose to use my identity. My father chose to accuse me of crimes he committed. Those were his choices. I simply chose not to protect him from the consequences of those choices anymore. That's not vindictiveness, that's clarity. This story taught me something I think you need to hear. The mistake most people make when they have been betrayed by family is believing that staying silent somehow protects the family's reputation. It doesn't. Silence protects the person committing the betrayal. Silence allows the damage to keep spreading. Silence makes you a co-conspirator in your own harm. What I understood that nobody else in my family understood was that the only way to save myself was to tell the truth, completely, and without apology. The only way to heal was to let the consequences fall where they were meant to fall. So, here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever found yourself protecting someone who is actively harming you? Have you ever stayed silent because you were told that family comes first, that loyalty matters more than your own safety. If you have, I want you to know that you're not alone. I want you to know that you're not wrong for considering breaking that silence. And I want you to know that the people who truly love you will respect you more for having boundaries than they ever will for sacrificing yourself. Now, I'm curious about you. What would you do if you discovered that someone you trusted had been stealing your identity? Would you try to handle it privately, or would you expose it, even if it meant public family drama? Comment down below with a 1, 2, or 3. 1 if you would keep it quiet, 2 if you're not sure, 3 if you would expose them completely. And while you're down there commenting, I want to know, where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? And have you ever had to cut off family members who were toxic? I want to hear your stories. I want to hear about the times you chose yourself over the approval of people who claim to love you, because those stories matter. Those moments of choosing yourself matter, and you deserve to have them witnessed and validated. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, I want to thank you. I want to ask you to click that subscribe button and turn on notifications so that you never miss one of these stories again. These are stories about people choosing themselves. These are stories about truth winning. These are stories about the quiet strength it takes to stand alone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening.